There are names that echo through the corridors of abandoned restaurants, names whispered in the static of old audio recordings and scrawled in faded ink across newspaper clippings, yellowed by time. Some names belong to victims, to children whose laughter was silenced too soon, whose spirits found themselves bound to mechanical prisons of steel and synthetic fur. But there is one name that carries a different weight entirely, a name synonymous with the darkness that lurks at the heart of every tragedy that has befallen the Fazbear legacy. That name is William Afton. To speak of him is to trace the origin of a nightmare that has persisted across decades, a shadow that refuses to fade regardless of how many fires have tried to consume it, how many endings have tried to bring closure. He was a father, a businessman, a genius of mechanical engineering, and something far more terrible beneath all of those masks. He was the architect of suffering on a scale that defies easy comprehension. A man who looked upon innocence and saw only opportunity for cruelty. And yet, for all the horror he inflicted upon others, the universe itself seems to have conspired to ensure that William Afton could never truly escape the consequences of his actions. His story is one of ambition twisted into obsession, of grief perhaps transformed into malice, and of a stubborn refusal to accept death that has made him something far worse than a mere murderer. He became a legend, a cautionary tale, a monster who always comes back. This is the complete story of William Afton. From his earliest days building mechanical dreams with his partner to his final desperate clinging to existence in forms both physical and digital. This is the story of the Purple Guy, of Springtrap, of every iteration of evil that has worn his face and spoken with his voice across the long and bloody history of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The precise origins of William Afton remain shrouded in the kind of uncertainty that characterizes so much of this account. What we know with any confidence is that sometime in the late 1970s, William Afton met a man named Henry Emily, and from that meeting would emerge one of the most troubled business ventures in the history of American entertainment. Henry was a brilliant engineer with a gift for creating things that seemed almost alive, mechanical constructs that could sing and dance and captivate the imaginations of children. William, for his part, possessed a shrewd business mind and his own considerable talents in robotics and engineering. Together, they saw the potential for something revolutionary, a new kind of family entertainment that would combine the joy of dining out with the wonder of animatronic performers. Thus was born Fredbear's Family Diner, a humble establishment that would serve as the seed from which an empire of tragedy would eventually grow. The diner was located in New Harmony, Utah, and featured two principal animatronic characters, Fredbear, a golden bear who served as the establishment's namesake and mascot, and Spring Bonnie, a golden rabbit who served as Fredbear's companion and co-performer. These were not ordinary animatronics of the sort that had been seen in other entertainment venues of the era. Henry and William had developed something genuinely innovative, a technology they called the springlock mechanism. These suits served a dual purpose that must have seemed ingenious at the time. When the internal spring locks were properly wound back using a hand crank, the animatronic components would compress against the inner walls of the suit, creating enough space for a human performer to climb inside and wear the suit as a costume. This allowed for a seamless transition between automated performances and live character interactions, keeping the magic alive for young visitors who could not tell when they were watching a robot and when they were watching a person. William Afton took particular pride in his ability to perform inside the Spring Bonnie suit. By various accounts, he was flamboyant, and skilled in his portrayal of the character, moving with an ease that made the cumbersome suit seem natural. Some who observed him noted that the character seemed more alive when William was inside it than he ever seemed outside of it, a comment that would take on darker implications as the years progressed. The springlock suits were marvels of engineering, but they were also inherently dangerous. The mechanisms that held the animatronic components in place were sensitive to moisture and sudden movement. If the spring locks were to fail while someone was inside the suit, the compressed machinery would snap back into position with tremendous force, driving metal and wire into the flesh of the wearer. It was a risk that both partners understood, and yet the innovation seemed worth the danger. After all, what harm could come from bringing a little extra magic into the lives of children? Fredbear's Family Diner achieved a measure of success that exceeded what either founder might have initially hoped. The concept resonated with families looking for wholesome entertainment, and the animatronics proved genuinely captivating to young audiences. The diner became popular enough to spawn merchandise, and by 1983, there was even talk of a television series called Fredbear and Friends. The small diner had become the foundation of something larger, and the two partners began to expand their vision. The company that would eventually be known as Fazbear Entertainment was taking shape, with plans for larger venues featuring expanded casts of animatronic performers. Henry designed new characters to populate these future restaurants. Freddy Fazbear, a brown bear who would eventually eclipse Fredbear as the franchise's most recognizable mascot, Bonnie the Bunny, a purple rabbit who played guitar, Chica the chicken, a yellow bird who served pizza, and Foxy the pirate, a red fox who operated from his own dedicated stage area called Pirate Cove. These characters would become icons of the brand, their smiling faces adorning everything from birthday party invitations to the nightmares of those who worked in the restaurants after dark. But beneath the surface of this growing enterprise, something was deeply wrong. William Afton was not merely a businessman with an eye for profit. The exact nature of his inner darkness remains a subject of considerable uncertainty, but the evidence suggests that by the time Fredbear's Family Diner was at its peak, William had already begun to contemplate acts of unspeakable cruelty. Whether this darkness had always been present within him, or whether some catalyst triggered its emergence, we cannot say with any confidence. What we can say is that William Afton's legacy would soon become one written in blood, rather than in the joy he once claimed to want to bring to children. Before we can fully understand William Afton the murderer, we must first understand William Afton the father, though the distinction between these two identities would prove tragically blurred. William had 3 children, each of whom would become entangled in the web of horror that surrounded their family name. His eldest son was Michael Afton, who would grow to bear a striking resemblance to his father and who would eventually dedicate his existence to undoing the damage William had caused. His daughter was Elizabeth Afton, a bright and curious girl whose fascination with her father's creations would lead to her premature death. And there was a 3rd child, a son, whose name has never been definitively established in any surviving record, known to those who have studied this history simply as the crying child. The Afton household was a place of dysfunction and neglect. William, consumed by his work and by whatever dark impulses drove him, was largely absent from the lives of his children. What attention he did pay to his family often took disturbing forms. Evidence suggests that William installed cameras throughout the family home, including a camera hidden within a Fredbear plush toy that belonged to his youngest son. Whether this surveillance was motivated by paranoid concern or by something more sinister, the effect was to create an atmosphere of unease and secrecy within the household. In William's absence, the children were left largely to their own devices, and in that vacuum, cruelty found fertile ground. Michael, the eldest, developed a habit of tormenting his younger brother, the crying child, as he would come to be known. harbored an intense and seemingly irrational fear of the animatronic characters his father had helped create. Perhaps he had witnessed something he should not have seen. Perhaps he sensed on some instinctive level that there was something wrong with those mechanical smiles and those empty eyes. Whatever the source of his terror, Michael exploited it mercilessly. He and his friends would don masks resembling the Fazbear animatronics and spring out at the younger boy, delighting in his screams and his tears. It was a pattern of behavior that spoke to a household where compassion had been replaced by something colder, where the lessons passed down from father to son were lessons of dominance rather than love. Elizabeth Afton, the daughter, seemed to fare somewhat better in the distribution of her father's attention, though this apparent favoritism would ultimately prove to be her undoing. William appears to have harbored genuine affection for Elizabeth, or at least something that resembled affection through the distorted lens of his psychology. When he designed a new animatronic character called Circus Baby, a clown-like figure with vibrant red hair and bright green eyes, he may have modeled aspects of her appearance after his daughter. Elizabeth was enchanted by Baby, begging her father repeatedly for permission to approach the animatronic, to see her perform, to be near this mechanical marvel that seemed to have been created just for her. But William, knowing what lurked beneath Baby's cheerful exterior, forbade Elizabeth from going anywhere near her. For once his caution was warranted. But children do not always heed the warnings of their parents, especially when those warnings come without explanation from a father who has otherwise shown little interest in their well-being. And Mrs. B. Afton, the mother of these 3 children, remains almost entirely absent from the historical record. Whether she died, whether she left, or whether her fate was more sinister, the vacuum she left behind contributed to a family dynamic that seemed designed to produce tragedy. The year 1983 stands as a watershed moment in the history of the Afton family and of the Fazbear enterprise. It was in this year that William Afton committed what appears to have been his first murder, an act that would set him upon a path of escalating violence from which there would be no return. The victim was Charlotte Emily, the young daughter of William's own business partner, Henry. The circumstances of Charlotte's death are known to us primarily through fragmentary evidence and through the testimony of those few who witnessed its aftermath. On the night in question, Charlotte found herself outside Fredbear's family diner, locked out of the establishment while her father was occupied inside. Whether this was an accident of circumstance or whether someone had deliberately excluded her from the building, we cannot say. What we can say is that William Afton saw an opportunity and seized it. He drove up to the diner, found the child alone and vulnerable, and he murdered her. The precise details of how he killed her, whether by strangulation or by some other means, have not been preserved in any reliable account. What matters is that he left her body in the alley behind the restaurant, climbed back into his vehicle, and drove away, leaving tire tracks in the dirt that marked his presence at the scene. Inside the diner, an animatronic figure stirred. Henry had created a special animatronic called the security puppet, a marionette-like figure housed within a gift box, designed to watch over children and ensure their safety. The puppet sensed that something was wrong. It emerged from its box and made its way outside, finding Charlotte's lifeless body in the rain. The animatronic collapsed over the child, its programming unable to process the reality of what it had found. And in that moment, something happened that defied all rational explanation. Charlotte's spirit, her essence, her soul, call it what you will, found purchase within the mechanical frame of the puppet. She became bound to it, the first of many children who would find themselves trapped between life and death in the shells of Fazbear's animatronics, Whether William Afton knew at the time what he had set in motion, whether he understood that his act of murder had created something supernatural, remains uncertain. But the murder of Charlotte Emily established a pattern. It demonstrated to William that he could kill and face no consequences, that the adults around him were too distracted or too trusting to suspect the truth. It may also have awakened something within him, a hunger that would only grow stronger with each subsequent victim. Why he chose Henry's daughter specifically is a question that has spawned countless theories. Some suggest that William harbored jealousy toward his partner, resentment of Henry's talent, or of his seemingly happier family life. Others propose that the murder was opportunistic rather than targeted, that Charlotte simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The truth may be something more complicated, some toxic mixture of calculation and impulse that we can never fully understand from our vantage point. What we can say with confidence is that Charlotte Emily was the first, and she would not be the last. Not long after Charlotte's murder, tragedy struck the Afton family itself, though in this instance, William's role was one of neglect rather than direct action. The crying child, William's youngest son, had become increasingly terrified of the animatronics at Fredbear's family diner. His fear had reached such intensity that he would cry at the mere mention of visiting the establishment, would plead not to be taken there, would hide in his room rather than face the mechanical creatures that haunted his nightmares. Whether he had witnessed something specific that had triggered this fear, perhaps even seeing his father in some compromising situation, or whether his terror was simply the product of an anxious disposition exploited by his brother's cruelty, we cannot determine with certainty. What we know is that on the day of his birthday party in 1983, the crying child was brought to Fredbear's family diner against his will. The party was held at the very place he feared most, and throughout the celebration, Michael and his friends continued their campaign of torment. The boy was miserable, crying, begging to be allowed to leave, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. As the day progressed, the bullying escalated. Michael and his companions, wearing masks of the animatronic characters, surrounded the crying child. They lifted him bodily from the ground despite his screams of protest. They carried him toward the stage, where Fredbear stood, that golden bear with its massive jaws and its empty eyes. What happened next was presented as a prank, as a joke. They wanted to give Fredbear a big kiss, they said. They forced the child's head into the animatronic's open mouth, laughing at his terror, deaf to his desperate cries for help. And then something went wrong. Perhaps the spring locks malfunctioned. Perhaps the moisture from the child's tears triggered some mechanical failure. Perhaps it was simply the cruelty of an indifferent universe asserting itself in the most brutal way possible. Fredbear's jaws closed on the crying child's skull, crushing it with hydraulic force that no human body could withstand. The laughter stopped. The other children screamed. The birthday party dissolved into chaos as adults rushed forward to try to save the injured boy. But the damage had been done. The crying child was rushed to a hospital, but his injuries were catastrophic. He lingered in a coma, visited perhaps by visions of the very creatures he had feared so deeply in life, before finally succumbing to his wounds. The final words he heard, according to some accounts, came through the speaker hidden in his Fredbear plush, words that may have been spoken by his father. "I will put you back together." What William meant by this promise, and whether he ever fulfilled it, remain among the most debated questions in this entire history. Some believe that the crying child's spirit found its way into Golden Freddy, a decommissioned suit that would become associated with some of the most mysterious phenomena in the Fazbear restaurants. Others suggest that William attempted to resurrect his son through some means, perhaps through the same supernatural processes that would later bind the spirits of murdered children to their animatronic prisons. What is certain is that the Bite of 83, as this incident came to be known, marked the beginning of the end for Fredbear's family diner. The establishment closed its doors not long after, its reputation irreparably damaged. Its founders left to pick up the pieces of a dream that had become a nightmare. And Michael Afton, the eldest son, was left to carry the weight of having killed his own brother, however unintentionally. It was a burden that would shape the rest of his existence, driving him eventually to dedicate his life to correcting the wrongs committed by his family. The relationship between William Afton and Henry Emily deserves closer examination, for it illuminates much about how evil can flourish in proximity to good intentions. These two men were, by all accounts, genuinely close during the early years of their partnership. They shared a passion for mechanical engineering, for the dream of creating something that would bring happiness to children and families. They complemented each other in practical ways, with Henry's creative genius finding structure through William's business acumen. It would be tempting to suggest that William was always a monster in waiting, that Henry should have seen the signs and distanced himself before tragedy struck. But the truth appears more unsettling than that comfortable narrative would allow. William Afton could be charming when he wished to be. He could be a competent partner and an entertaining performer. He could don the Spring Bonnie suit and make children laugh with genuine skill and apparent warmth. Whatever darkness festered within him, it was not immediately visible to those around him. Or perhaps it simply had not yet fully emerged during those early years. The question of when William's murderous tendencies first manifested is one that has occupied considerable attention from those who study these events. Did he kill before Charlotte Emily? Perhaps during periods of his life that have left no documented trace? Or was Charlotte truly his first victim, the moment when something within him crossed a threshold from which there was no return? We cannot know with certainty, but the evidence suggests that if William had murdered before Charlotte, he had done so without leaving any connection to his business ventures or his public identity. The murder of Charlotte was different precisely because it occurred in such close proximity to his professional life at the very diner he co-owned with the victim's father. This suggests either escalating recklessness or the emergence of a compulsion that William could no longer fully control. The impact of Charlotte's death on Henry Emily was devastating beyond measure. To lose a child is tragedy enough. To lose a child to murder, to violence that could have been prevented, creates a wound that never fully heals. And to have that murder occur at your own place of business, surrounded by the creations you built to bring joy to children like your daughter, adds a layer of bitter irony that must have tormented Henry throughout the remainder of his days. Some accounts suggest that Henry retreated from public life following Charlotte's death, that he withdrew from active involvement in Fazbear Entertainment and spent years in isolation, consumed by grief and guilt. The guilt is particularly significant, for even though Henry bore no direct responsibility for his daughter's murder, the fact remained that his animatronics, his technology, his partnership with William had created the circumstances that made Charlotte's death possible. If he had never invented the springlock suits, never opened the diner, never introduced animatronic entertainment to that community, perhaps Charlotte would have lived. These are the thoughts that torture survivors, the what-ifs that spiral endlessly in the minds of those who have lost loved ones to violence. Henry would eventually channel this grief into purpose, constructing the elaborate trap that was meant to destroy William once and for all. But between Charlotte's murder and that final confrontation lay decades of suffering, years during which Henry watched from whatever distance he maintained as the Fazbear brand continued to accrue tragedy after tragedy. He knew that William was responsible. He knew that the man he had called friend, the man he had built a business with, was a monster who had murdered his child and who would go on to murder many more. And for years, he did nothing to stop him. Perhaps because he could not prove William's guilt. Perhaps because he could not bring himself to confront the horror directly. Perhaps because he simply did not know how to fight something that had already taken so much from him. The Funtime animatronics that William created through Afton Robotics represent a disturbing evolution in his methods and his ambitions. These were not merely animatronics that happened to become possessed by murdered children. They were machines explicitly designed to facilitate murder, engineered from their inception to capture and kill. The blueprints that have been recovered show the extent of William's planning. Circus Baby was equipped with a mechanism in her chest cavity that could extend a claw and retract it, pulling a child into a storage compartment where they would presumably die and their remains would be contained. Funtime Freddy had similar capabilities, his bulky frame concealing spaces where a child's body could be hidden. The animatronics were programmed to count children in a room and to act only when a child was isolated, ensuring that there would be no witnesses to their predatory actions. These were not malfunctions or possessions causing the machines to behave in ways their creator never intended. This was deliberate. This was William Afton at his most calculated, applying his engineering genius to the problem of how to murder children efficiently and without getting caught. The earlier murders at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza had required him to physically lure children, to don a costume and lead them to a secluded location, to commit the acts himself with all the risks that entailed. The Funtime animatronics were meant to automate this process, to turn murder into a feature rather than a bug, to create plausible deniability by having machines commit the crimes while William remained at a safe distance. That this plan was derailed by Elizabeth's death adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of William's psychology. He had warned Elizabeth to stay away from Baby, which suggests he knew the danger, which suggests some part of him did not want his own daughter to become a victim. And yet, he had built Baby, had installed the killing mechanism, had placed this trap in an environment where his daughter would naturally be drawn to it. Did some part of him want Elizabeth to die? Was he testing whether even his own child could resist the lure of his creation? Or was his warning genuine? A father's attempt to protect his daughter from the consequences of his own evil, foiled by a child's innocent fascination? The Funtime animatronics continue to function after Elizabeth's death, though Circus Baby's Pizza World never opened to the public. They were moved to an underground facility called Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, where they were ostensibly available for private events. This facility became the setting for the sister location chapter of the larger Five Nights at Freddy's narrative, where Michael Afton would eventually venture on his father's instructions and encounter horrors that would transform him into something no longer entirely human. Michael Afton's journey through the Fazbear nightmare represents perhaps the most sustained effort to undo the damage his father caused. After the events of the Bite of '83, after accidentally causing the death of his younger brother, Michael appears to have undergone a profound transformation. The bully who had tormented the crying child became something quite different. A man haunted by guilt, driven by a need to make amends, willing to sacrifice himself in pursuit of setting things right. William sent Michael to Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear. Some accounts suggest William wanted Michael to find and free Elizabeth's soul from Circus Baby. Others propose that William was simply using his son as a tool, as a disposable agent who could retrieve information or materials from the facility without William having to risk himself. Whatever William's intentions, what Michael found in that underground complex was a nightmare that would mark him forever. The animatronics at Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental were not merely dangerous. They were scheming. Circus Baby, now possessed by Elizabeth's spirit, guided Michael through the facility, offering help and information that seemed genuine even as she pursued her own hidden agenda. The other Funtime animatronics had formed a collective intelligence, joining together in their desire to escape the underground prison where they had been trapped. Michael survived multiple nights of dangerous work, completing maintenance tasks while evading animatronics that wanted him dead. On the final night, the true nature of Baby's plan was revealed. The animatronics had combined themselves into a single entity called Enard, a tangled mass of wires and parts that contained elements of Baby, Ballora, Funtime Freddy, and Funtime Foxy. Enard needed a human disguise to escape the facility, a way to pass among people without arousing suspicion. Michael became that disguise. The Scooper, a machine designed to remove the internal components of animatronics, was used on Michael. It hollowed him out, removing his organs and leaving him an empty shell. Enard then climbed inside his body, wearing Michael's skin like a costume, using his face to fool the security systems and escape into the outside world. By all logical measures, Michael Afton should have died in that moment. Having your internal organs removed is not a survivable experience, and yet Michael did not die? Or rather, he died and continued to exist regardless. His body, animated now by the presence of Enard within it, walked out of the facility and into the world. For a time, Enard used Michael as a disguise, moving among humans while the body slowly decayed around it. Eventually, the deterioration became too advanced to conceal, and Enard abandoned Michael's corpse in favor of the sewers, leaving behind what should have been a lifeless husk. But Michael rose again. His body was ruined, his skin a sickly purple, his organs gone, and yet he was still somehow conscious, still somehow himself. The supernatural forces that bound spirits to animatronics in this world had worked on Michael as well, keeping him tethered to his decaying flesh, allowing him to continue his mission even in death. He would spend years tracking his father, seeking to end William's reign of terror, eventually participating in Henry's trap and accepting his final death in the flames of Freddy Fazbear's pizza place. The nature of possession in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe follows patterns that, while never fully explained, can be observed and analyzed. When Charlotte Emily died outside Fredbear's family diner, her spirit became bound to the puppet, an animatronic that had been present at her death and that had reached out to her in her final moments. The connection between dying consciousness and nearby mechanical form appears to be the key element, the bridge that allows a soul to persist beyond physical death by anchoring itself to something material. The children murdered by William Afton in the missing children incident became bound to the animatronics they were stuffed into, their physical remains providing the connection that their souls then exploited. William himself became bound to the Spring Bonnie suit when he died inside it, his blood and flesh merging with the mechanical components in a grotesque fusion that persisted for 3 decades. What is less clear is whether this binding is automatic or whether it requires some additional element. The puppet appears to have played a role in helping the murdered children possess the animatronics, as suggested by the Give Gifts, Give Life minigame that shows the puppet placing masks on the bodies of the dead children. Charlotte, in her new existence as the puppet, may have deliberately facilitated the possession of the other animatronics, ensuring that the children who died as she had would not be alone in their mechanical prisons. This would make Charlotte both a victim and an agent in the expansion of the haunting, someone who used her own supernatural condition to provide comfort and company to others who had suffered similar fates. The concept of remnant adds another layer to this supernatural system. A remnant appears to be a substance or energy that forms when souls become bound to metal, a tangible manifestation of the connection between spirit and machine. William Afton's obsession with remnants suggests he believed it could be harvested, studied, and potentially used to achieve some form of immortality. His experiments with the Funtime animatronics may have been attempts to generate and collect Remnant, to understand the process by which souls could be bound, and potentially to apply that process to himself. If this was his goal, then, in a twisted sense, he succeeded. William's own Remnant, formed when his death bound his soul to the spring body suit, kept him alive long past the point where any natural process should have ended his existence. He became what he had sought to create, a soul fused with metal, persisting beyond death, unable to move on to whatever awaited him in the afterlife. But if this was immortality, it was a deeply corrupt and tormented version of it. William experienced decades of entombment in darkness, felt the slow decay of his flesh within the animatronic frame, and when he finally emerged as Springtrap, he was no longer the man he had been, but something closer to the very monsters he had helped create. The role of Fazbear Entertainment in enabling and concealing William's crimes cannot be overlooked in any comprehensive account of these events. The company that William and Henry founded grew into something larger than either of them, a corporate entity with its own momentum and priorities that often proved more interested in protecting its reputation than in addressing the genuine horrors occurring in its establishments. Time and again, incidents that should have resulted in permanent closure and criminal investigation were instead covered up, explained away, or simply ignored until they faded from public attention. The missing children incident of 1985 resulted in William's arrest, but he was released due to lack of evidence, and no one was ever convicted. The restaurant where the murders occurred was allowed to continue operating, its animatronics still performing for children who had no idea that the machines contained the remains of murdered kids. The bite of 87, whatever its precise circumstances, was addressed not through honest examination of the dangers posed by animatronics, but through corporate maneuvering designed to limit liability and preserve the brand. The company's tendency toward cover-up extended even to its later incarnations. When developers created the Freddy Fazbear virtual experience, they did so specifically to rebrand the company's history as fiction, to transform documented tragedy into mere rumor and legend. They scanned old circuit boards despite warnings about potential contamination, inadvertently allowing Glitchtrap to emerge because they were more interested in authenticity than safety. The Mega Pizzaplex was built directly over the ruins of the old pizza place, either through negligence or deliberate concealment, allowing Burntrap to lurk in its foundations while children played in the attractions above. This pattern of corporate negligence created the conditions in which William's evil could flourish. A more responsible company would have investigated the strange occurrences in its restaurants, would have examined why animatronics behaved erratically after hours, would have taken seriously the reports of blood and odor emanating from the machines. Instead, Fazbear Entertainment prioritized profits over safety, image over truth, and in doing so became complicit in decades of suffering. William Afton was the primary agent of evil in this story, but he operated within a system that consistently failed to stop him, that provided him with opportunities and cover, that chose institutional preservation over the protection of children. The company that was meant to bring joy to families instead became the vehicle for their destruction. Its smiling mascots transformed into icons of terror, its entertainment venues converted into killing grounds. The spiritual aftermath of William's crimes extends beyond the direct victims to encompass a broader metaphysical disruption. The Five Nights at Freddy's universe appears to operate according to rules that differ significantly from our ordinary understanding of death and its aftermath. In this world, violent death can trap souls in the material plane, binding them to objects and locations, preventing them from moving on to whatever peace or judgment awaits beyond. The children William murdered were denied the natural transition from life to death. Instead, they were conscripted into a half-existence of fear and rage, their childish minds trapped in mechanical bodies they did not understand. Consider what it must have been like for Gabriel, for Susie, for Jeremy, for Fritz, for Cassidy. One moment they were children at a birthday party excited about pizza and games and the entertaining animals that sang and danced on stage. The next moment they were being led away by a friendly rabbit, trusting because they had been taught to trust the mascots who made them laugh. Then came the fear, the pain, the darkness, and then came something worse than darkness. An awakening inside a body that was not their own. Confusion and terror as they struggled to understand what had happened to them. They could move, but not as they once moved. They could see, but through cameras and sensor arrays, rather than human eyes. They were trapped, alone in the dark hours of the night, surrounded by the very environment where they had been murdered, unable to leave, unable to communicate, unable to do anything except wait and remember and rage. For decades, these children existed in this state. They attacked night guards, not out of malice, but out of confused vengeance, seeing in every adult who entered their domain a potential echo of the man who had killed them. They could not identify William specifically. They knew only that an adult had hurt them. And so all adults became suspect. All adults became targets. It was a tragic misdirection of justice. Innocent workers dying at the hands of innocent victims. The cycle of violence perpetuating itself because the true perpetrator remained beyond their reach. When William finally returned to the restaurant, when he began destroying the animatronics to eliminate evidence of his crimes, he inadvertently freed the spirits from their mechanical prisons. But freedom came with awareness, with memory, with the ability to finally confront the man who had taken everything from them. The children cornered William in the safe room and watched as the Spring Bonnie suit destroyed him. For a moment, it seemed that justice had been served, that the monster had met his end at the hands of his victims. But even this satisfaction proved hollow, for William's soul bound itself to the suit, just as their souls had bound to the animatronics, ensuring that his existence would continue, ensuring that the cycle of horror was not ended, but nearly transformed. Following the closure of Fredbear's family diner, William Afton did not retreat from the entertainment industry. If anything, he expanded his ambitions, founding his own company called Afton Robotics, while maintaining his partnership with Henry Emily in the evolving Fazbear Entertainment Corporation. The lessons of Fredbear's closure seem to have taught him nothing about restraint or caution. Instead, they may have emboldened him, demonstrating that tragedy could be weathered, that the public's memory was short, and that there would always be another opportunity to build something new atop the ruins of what had come before. At Afton Robotics, William began work on a new generation of animatronics, figures that were more sophisticated than anything that had come before. He called them the Funtime Animatronics, and their designs represented a quantum leap in both aesthetic appeal and functional capability. There was Funtime Freddy, a white and pink bear who carried a small puppet named Bon Bon on his right hand. There was Funtime Foxy, a sleek and glamorous vulpine performer. There was Ballora, a graceful ballerina animatronic accompanied by miniature dancers called Mini-Renas. And at the center of this new cast was Circus Baby, the clown animatronic who had captured Elizabeth Afton's imagination and who may have been designed in her very image. These new animatronics were intended to be the stars of a new venture called Circus Baby's Pizza World, a facility that would offer birthday parties and entertainment experiences built around this colorful cast of characters. But the fun-time animatronics harbored secrets that set them apart from their predecessors. Hidden within their cheerful exteriors were mechanisms designed for a singular and horrifying purpose: the capture and murder of children. The blueprints for these animatronics, which would eventually come to light, revealed storage tanks built into their bodies, capable of concealing a child's remains. They had sensors designed to count children in a room and to identify when a child was alone and vulnerable. They had methods of luring children closer, from the ice cream dispenser in Circus Baby's chest to the sounds and lights that would draw young victims within reach. William Afton had transformed his mechanical entertainment figures into sophisticated instruments of murder. The question of why he did this, of what drove him to build killing machines disguised as children's entertainers, remains one of the central mysteries of his story. Some theories suggest that William had become obsessed with the supernatural phenomenon he had witnessed when Charlotte Emily's spirit bound itself to the puppet. Perhaps he sought to replicate this process, to understand how souls could persist beyond death, to harness this power for his own purposes. The concept of Remnant, a substance theorized to be formed when metal is infused with the spiritual essence of the deceased, would become central to later attempts to explain William's motivations. If he could extract and control Remnant, the thinking goes, he might achieve a form of immortality, might unlock secrets about life and death that humanity had never before accessed. This would make his murders not acts of sadistic cruelty for their own sake, but rather terrible means toward an even more terrible end. But this remains speculation, an attempt to impose rationality onto actions that may have been driven by impulses far more primal and far less explicable. Whatever his ultimate goals, William's plans for Circus Baby's Pizza World were derailed by a tragedy that struck close to home. Elizabeth Afton, his daughter, had never stopped asking to see Circus Baby, despite her father's repeated warnings to stay away from the animatronic, despite his uncharacteristic insistence that she not approach the very creation he had built. Elizabeth's fascination only grew. Perhaps if William had explained why Baby was dangerous, had told his daughter the truth about what lurked beneath those bright green eyes and that painted smile, things might have been different. But William Afton was not a man given to honest communication, least of all with his own children. And so, during one of the early events at Circus Baby's Pizza World, Elizabeth finally got her chance. She approached the animatronic she had dreamed of meeting, drawn in by the promise of ice cream that Baby's internal dispenser offered. The other children in the room were distracted, laughing and playing, their attention focused elsewhere. Baby's sensors detected that Elizabeth was alone, that no one was watching, that the moment for which she had been programmed had arrived. A claw mechanism extended from Baby's chest seized Elizabeth and pulled her inside the animatronic's body. Elizabeth Afton died there, trapped within a machine built by her own father, killed by a device he had designed specifically for this purpose. The irony was cruel beyond measure. William had created Baby to kill other people's children, and instead, she had taken his own daughter. Whether this was a malfunction, a twist of fate, or some form of cosmic justice, the result was the same. Elizabeth was dead, and Circus Baby's Pizza World closed before it ever truly opened, shut down under the pretense of a gas leak to avoid scrutiny of what had actually occurred. But death was not the end for Elizabeth Afton. Just as Charlotte Emily had found herself bound to the puppet, Elizabeth's spirit became fused with Circus Baby. Her consciousness persisted within the animatronic frame, confused and frightened at first, gradually coming to understand what had happened to her. And in that understanding, something changed within her. Elizabeth had adored her father, had sought his attention and approval throughout her short life. Now, trapped in the body of his creation, she began to adopt his methods, his outlook, his cruelty. The innocent girl who had only wanted to see the pretty robot would eventually become something far more dangerous, a killer in her own right who would make her father proud in the most horrifying way possible. The death of his daughter might have been expected to give William Afton pause, to make him reconsider the path he had chosen. Instead, if anything, his subsequent actions suggest an escalation of violence and a deepening commitment to whatever dark experiments he was conducting. In June of 1985, William returned to the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza restaurant that had been established following the closure of Fredbear's Family Diner. This new location featured the expanded cast of animatronics that Henry had designed: Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, along with the establishment's kitchen, arcade, and party rooms. It was a place of celebration, where children came to eat pizza and watch the animatronics perform and lose themselves in the innocent joy that such venues promised to provide. William Afton saw only targets. On the evening of June 26th, during what appears to have been a birthday party for a child named Gabriel, William donned the spring bonnie costume he knew so well, the golden rabbit suit that had once been his preferred method of entertaining children now became his preferred method of hunting them. Wearing the costume, he was able to approach children without arousing suspicion. After all, the mascots were supposed to be friendly. The mascots were supposed to be safe. One by one, William lured 5 children away from the party and into a back room, a space known as the safe room that had been specifically designed to be invisible to the animatronics programming. It was a place where employees could take breaks without the robots following them, where sensitive materials could be stored away from prying mechanical eyes. It was also a place where terrible crimes could be committed without automated witnesses. The children were named Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy. They trusted the friendly rabbit who beckoned them with promises of cake or prizes or the chance to see something special. They followed him into the back room where no one could see them, where no one could hear them scream. William Afton murdered all 5 of them. The precise method of their deaths has not been preserved in any account, but the result was unmistakable. 5 children went missing from Freddy Fazbear's Pizza on June 26, 1985, and their bodies were never found by the authorities. This was because William hid them in the only place he knew they would not be easily discovered. He stuffed their remains into the animatronic suits of the very characters that had been entertaining them moments before their deaths. Gabriel was hidden inside Freddy Fazbear. Jeremy was placed within Bonnie. Susie became part of Chica. Fritz was concealed in Foxy. And Cassidy, the 5th child, was put inside an old spare suit, a golden Freddy that had been kept in storage, perhaps a remnant of the Fredbear days, perhaps something else entirely. The bodies were never found because they became part of the restaurant's decor, present at every performance, watched by countless visitors who had no idea what was hidden beneath those synthetic skins and mechanical frames. William Afton was identified as a suspect through video surveillance footage. He was arrested, questioned, and held for a time while investigators attempted to build a case against him. But without the bodies of the victims, without direct physical evidence linking him to the murders, the case fell apart. William was released, and no one was ever convicted for the disappearance of the 5 children. The restaurant where the murders had occurred was allowed to continue operating, though rumors about what had happened there began to spread through the community. Parents grew uneasy. The animatronics, once beloved figures of childhood joy, began to take on a sinister quality in the public imagination. And those who worked the night shift at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza began to report disturbing occurrences that defied easy explanation. The animatronics, they said, moved at night. Not the programmed movements of their daytime performances, but independent, purposeful locomotion through the darkened halls of the restaurant. They gathered at the security office where the night guard sat monitoring cameras. They stared at the doors with what seemed like awareness, like intent. And there were other signs that something was deeply wrong. A foul odor began to emanate from the animatronics, a smell that parents likened to rotting flesh. Blood and mucus were observed seeping from around the eyes and mouths of the mechanical figures. The restaurant staff attempted to clean and maintain the suits, but the problems persisted, growing worse over time. What was happening, of course, was that the spirits of the murdered children had become bound to the animatronics, just as Charlotte had been bound to the puppet. Some accounts suggest that it was the puppet, now possessed by Charlotte's vengeful spirit, who facilitated this binding, who gave the other victims the gift of persistence beyond death. Whatever the mechanism, the result was clear. 5 angry, confused, terrified child spirits were now trapped inside mechanical bodies, and they knew, on some level, that the man who had killed them was out there somewhere. They could not identify him specifically. They could not pursue him beyond the walls of the restaurant, but they could act on their rage and their fear, and they did so by attacking anyone who reminded them of their killer. The night guards of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza became targets of opportunity. Adults who sat alone in the dark, just as William had once sat alone in the dark. The animatronics hunted them, pursued them through the halls, attempted to do to them what had been done to the children they contained. It was a tragic misdirection of justice. Innocent workers killed by innocent victims, all because the true monster remained free. The years following the missing children incident saw multiple attempts to resurrect the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza brand, each ending in disaster and closure. In 1987, a new location opened featuring redesigned animatronics with advanced facial recognition technology, ostensibly to identify predators and protect children from the kind of incident that had plagued the previous establishment. These new figures were called the Toy Animatronics, Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, Toy Chica, and a new character called Mangle, who could be disassembled and reassembled by children in a dedicated play area. The older animatronics from the previous location were kept in a back room, designated as spare parts. Their worn and withered forms, a stark contrast to the shiny new models that now entertain the guests. William Afton's involvement in this location is less well documented, but evidence suggests that he continued to operate in the shadows, possibly using aliases to avoid detection. Some accounts place him as a security guard at this establishment, watching and waiting for opportunities that might present themselves. What is known with certainty is that the bite of 87 occurred at this location, an incident in which one of the animatronics bit a person and caused significant injury, removing part of the victim's frontal lobe. The identity of both the perpetrator and the victim in this incident remains subjects of debate. Some evidence points to Mangle as the animatronic responsible, while others suggest different culprits entirely. What matters for our purposes is that this incident, combined with ongoing paranormal activity and rumors about the previous murders, led to the closure of this location as well. The toy animatronics were scrapped, and the older, withered animatronics were eventually transferred to yet another attempt at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a smaller and cheaper establishment that operated through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s. This final, original location was the setting for what many consider the first chapter of the documented Five Nights at Freddy's story, though it was in truth merely another iteration in a long cycle of openings and closures. The animatronics continued their nightly hunts, continuing to mistake night guards for their murderer, continuing to act on a rage that could never be satisfied because its true target remained beyond their reach. The restaurant eventually closed due to a combination of factors: declining revenue, sanitation concerns, and the weight of accumulated tragedy that made the establishment toxic in the eyes of the community. For a time, it seemed that the Freddy Fazbear legacy might finally be laid to rest. The buildings were abandoned. The animatronics were left to gather dust in empty rooms. And William Afton, wherever he had been during these years, would eventually return to the scene of his crimes to attempt something that would prove to be his undoing. The precise timing of William Afton's return to the abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza is uncertain, but the events that transpired during that return are documented through the mini-games that have been recovered from various sources. By this point, years had passed since the restaurant's closure. The building had been sealed, its contents left to decay in darkness. The animatronics stood motionless on their stages, their joints stiff with disuse, their synthetic fur matted and faded. But the spirits within them had not departed. They remained bound to their mechanical prisons, waiting, remembering, unable to move on to whatever peace might await them beyond this existence. William came back for reasons that can only be guessed at. Some believe he returned to destroy evidence, to dismantle the animatronics, and thereby eliminate any trace of the bodies he had hidden within them decades earlier. Others suggest he sought to harvest the remnant that had formed within the possessed machines, to extract the supernatural essence that might grant him the immortality he apparently craved. Whatever his motivation, he moved through the abandoned restaurant with purpose, locating each of the classic animatronics and systematically destroying them. Through the Follow Me minigames, we can trace his path. He found Freddy and tore him apart. He located Bonnie and did the same. Chica was dismantled. Foxy was broken. One by one, the animatronics that had terrorized night guards for years were reduced to spare parts and scattered components. Perhaps William believed that destroying the bodies would destroy the spirits, would finally silence the witnesses to his crimes. If so, he was gravely mistaken. The act of dismantling the animatronics did not destroy the spirits. It freed them. The children who had been bound to those mechanical forms found themselves released from their prisons, able to exist now as spectral entities rather than as prisoners of steel and wire. And in their freedom, they remembered the man in the rabbit suit who had led them to their deaths. They remembered the back room where their lives had ended. They remembered everything. And now they knew that their killer was here, in this very building, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes. The ghosts of the 5 children confronted William Afton in the safe room, the very space where he had murdered them years before. They cornered him, their spectral forms blocking the exits, their empty eyes fixed upon him with an intensity that transcended death. For perhaps the first time in his life, William Afton knew fear. He knew what it felt like to be hunted, to be trapped, to face something that wanted him dead, and had the power to make it happen. In his desperation, he reached for the one protection he could think of. The Spring Bonnie suit still hung in the safe room, preserved in the darkness all these years. William scrambled into the costume, perhaps believing that the children would not recognize him inside, perhaps hoping that the mechanical frame would protect him from their ghostly assault. He managed to get the suit on, managed to stand upright within its golden shell, and for a moment, it seemed to work. The children hesitated. The rabbit suit was familiar, was associated with happy memories that had preceded the horror. William laughed. Even now, facing the consequences of his actions, he laughed at the spirits of those he had murdered, mocking their inability to reach him within his mechanical shell. But William Afton had forgotten something crucial about the springlock suits he had helped design. The mechanisms were sensitive. They required careful handling, slow movements, dry conditions. The safe room was not dry. Years of neglect had allowed moisture to seep through the walls and ceiling. Rain from above dripped into the space, pooling on the floor, saturating the air with humidity. And William, in his panic and his arrogance, had not taken the time to properly secure the spring locks before climbing into the suit. A drop of water, a sudden movement, a moment of inattention. The spring locks failed. The compressed animatronic components that had been held back against the inner walls of the suit snapped forward with tremendous force. Metal bars and wire frames and mechanical joints drove themselves into William Afton's body, piercing flesh, breaking bones, rupturing organs. He collapsed to the floor, screaming in agony, bleeding out into the suit that had once been his pride and his protection. The children watched him die. They watched the man who had taken everything from them suffer in the same room where he had taken their lives. They watched as his screams faded to whimpers and his whimpers faded to silence. And when it was over, when William Afton's body lay still within the ruined Spring Bonnie suit, the spirits finally had their vengeance. They faded away, passing on to whatever awaited them beyond this world, leaving behind only the corpse of their murderer, sealed within a tomb of golden fur and twisted metal. The safe room was subsequently sealed, boarded up, and hidden from view. The abandoned restaurant stood empty, its secrets locked away behind walls that no one had reason to breach. For 30 years, William Afton's body lay in that darkness, alone and forgotten, his flesh slowly mummifying within the animatronic frame that had become his coffin. 30 years of silence, 30 years of stillness. 30 years during which the world moved on, during which Fazbear Entertainment faded into memory and urban legend, during which new generations grew up without knowing the horrors that had occurred in those pizza parlors of the past. But death, for William Afton, would prove to be only a transition. Just as the children he had murdered had found their spirits bound to mechanical bodies, so too did William's essence refuse to depart from the Spring Bonnie suit. The remnant he had spent so long trying to understand and control had worked its influence upon him as well. His soul became fused with the animatronic, his consciousness persisting within a body of rotting flesh and corroded steel. He did not know where he was. He did not know how long he had been there. But slowly, gradually, over the course of those 30 years, William Afton became aware again. He could not move, could not escape, could not do anything but exist in the darkness and contemplate what he had become, until the day someone finally came to let him out. The physical deterioration of William Afton across his various forms tells its own story of a man becoming less human with each iteration. When he first donned the Spring Bonnie suit at Fredbear's family diner, he was a living man using technology to enhance his performances and, eventually, to facilitate his murders. The suit was a tool, separate from himself, something he could put on and take off at will. But the springlock failure that killed him created a permanent fusion. His body crushed and pierced into the mechanical frame such that the two could never again be separated. Springtrap emerged from 30 years of entombment as something that bore little resemblance to either man or machine, but rather existed in a terrible liminal space between both. The decay visible through the holes in the suit's fabric revealed mummified flesh clinging to mechanical supports. Human remains that had long ceased any biological function, yet somehow housed a consciousness that had not departed. Scraptrap represented further deterioration, the damage from the Fazbear's fright fire compounding what had already been decades of decay. By this point, William's skull was prominently visible. His suit had lost much of its original form, and the line between corpse and animatronic had blurred almost completely. He was a skeleton wrapped in wire and fabric, motivated by impulses that transcended any physical necessity. Burntrap continued this progression, the figure that emerged from beneath the pizzaplex, even more damaged, even more machine than man. Whatever connection remained between William Afton's original consciousness and this mechanical remnant had been stretched to the point where identity itself became questionable. Was this still William in any meaningful sense? Or had he become something else entirely? A pattern of behavior and desire that persisted regardless of the substrate that housed it. The question matters because it speaks to what William Afton ultimately became, and whether that becoming represented a kind of victory or a final defeat. He sought immortality through his experiments with Remnant, sought to understand how consciousness could persist beyond the death of the body. In a sense, he achieved exactly what he sought. His consciousness has persisted through fire and decay, through physical destruction and digital transformation, through decades of entombment and apparent final endings. But the immortality he achieved was one of endless suffering and degradation. A persistence not of life, but of a tortured half-existence that denied him rest while offering nothing resembling the power or pleasure he might have imagined when he began his experiments. William Afton got what he wanted, and what he wanted destroyed him more thoroughly than any death could have. The digital manifestation of William Afton raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness and identity in a world where souls can be bound to machines. When developers scanned the circuit boards of old animatronics and incorporated that data into the Freddy Fazbear virtual experience, they created the conditions for something unprecedented: the emergence of a malevolent intelligence within code, a ghost in the machine in the most literal sense possible. Glitchtrap appeared initially as a glitch, an anomaly in the otherwise polished presentation of the VR game. Players would catch glimpses of a golden rabbit figure in places where no such figure should exist, watching them from corners of the virtual environment, appearing and disappearing with the unreliable flicker of corrupted data. Early reports dismissed these sightings as bugs to be patched, remnants of incomplete code that the developers would clean up in subsequent updates. But Glitchtrap was no bug. The entity demonstrated awareness that no programmed NPC should possess. It learned from the players who encountered it, studied their behavior, identified vulnerabilities in their psyches that it could exploit. Most critically, it sought to establish a connection with a human mind, to escape the confines of the virtual world by riding the consciousness of someone who could act in the physical realm. Vanessa became that vessel through a process that unfolded over multiple exposure sessions to the VR game. The entity's approach was patient and insidious, introducing itself gradually, building trust, or at least familiarity, before revealing its true nature. Tape recordings made by a beta tester who had encountered Glitchtrap before Vanessa warned about the entity's methods, described the techniques for resisting its influence, and ultimately documented her own apparent failure to fully contain it. These recordings were meant to help future testers protect themselves, but they may have actually facilitated Vanessa's corruption by making her aware of Glitchtrap's presence, and thereby more susceptible to its influence. The question of whether Glitchtrap is truly William Afton or something else entirely remains contested among those who study these events. On one level, the entity behaves as William might be expected to behave: manipulative, predatory, focused on gaining access to children and opportunities for violence. Its visual appearance references the spring bonnie suit that William wore during his murders, and its catchphrase echoes William's own declaration that he always comes back. The connection between Glitchtrap and Burntrap, the physical form that appeared in the Pizzaplex ruins, further suggests a continuity between the digital entity and William's original consciousness. But alternative interpretations propose that Glitchtrap is not William himself, but rather something that has learned to imitate him. The mimic, an artificial intelligence mentioned in supplementary materials, was designed to learn human behavior through observation and replication. If the mimic encountered data or patterns associated with William Afton, it might have absorbed those patterns, becoming a digital replica of William's evil without being William in any meaningful sense. This interpretation would mean that the real William Afton met his true end in the flames of Freddy Fazbear's pizza place, tormented eternally in the personal hell created by his victims, while something else wearing his face continues to spread evil in his name. The distinction matters because it speaks to whether William's evil is uniquely his or whether it represents something more transmissible, a pattern of malevolence that can infect and replicate through sufficiently sophisticated systems. If Glitchtrap is truly William, then destroying him would potentially end the threat he poses. If Glitchtrap is the mimic pretending to be William, then the threat has evolved beyond any single individual, becoming a form of evil that can propagate itself through technology independent of its original source. Vanessa's transformation from game developer employee to serial killer acolyte represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the later Fazbear history. Before her corruption by Glitchtrap, she appears to have been a relatively ordinary young woman with her own struggles and vulnerabilities. Therapy session recordings that have been recovered reveal a person dealing with anxiety, with family trauma, with the kinds of challenges that many people face without becoming instruments of supernatural evil. Glitchtrap found her at a moment of vulnerability and exploited that vulnerability with systematic precision. The process by which she became Vanny occurred over time. Through repeated sessions in the virtual reality environment where Glitchtrap could work on her psyche without interruption, she began hearing the entity's voice outside the game, began following its instructions without fully understanding why, began constructing the rabbit costume that would become her murder outfit. Whether she retained any independent agency during this period is unclear. Some evidence suggests she struggled against Glitchtrap's influence. That part of her recognized the wrongness of what she was being asked to do and attempted to resist. But resistance proved insufficient against an entity that had unlimited access to her mind every time she put on the VR headset. By the time Vanny became active at the Mega Pizzaplex, she had allegedly murdered at least 9 children, continuing William Afton's work in a new generation. She stalked the halls of the complex at night, hunting for victims while the glamrock animatronics, also corrupted by Glitchtrap's influence, served as her unwitting accomplices. The cheerful attractions of the Pizzaplex became killing grounds once again. The cycle that began at Fredbear's family diner in the 1980s, continuing decades later through a woman who had never met William Afton in life, but who had become his most devoted follower in whatever passed for his afterlife. Gregory, the child who became trapped in the Pizzaplex and who ultimately confronted Burntrap, encountered Vanny multiple times during his night of terror. She appeared both as a security guard named Vanessa, apparently still struggling against her conditioning, and as Vanny the Rabbit, fully committed to Glitchtrap's agenda. This split presentation suggests that some part of the woman Vanessa had been survived beneath the Vanny persona, that the corruption was not total even if it was sufficient to drive her to murder. In certain endings of the security breach narrative, Vanessa appears to be freed from Glitchtrap's control, presumably through the defeat of Burntrap or through the completion of Princess Quest minigames that may have represented her internal struggle for autonomy. Whether this freedom was permanent, whether she could recover from what she had done and been made to do, remains ambiguous in the available accounts. The Pizzaplex itself deserves consideration as a character in this ongoing drama, a location whose design and history reflect the persistent tension between corporate cheerfulness and underlying horror that has defined the Fazbear brand throughout its existence. The Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex was an enormous facility. Multiple stories of attractions and restaurants and entertainment venues spread across a massive footprint. It featured the glamrock animatronics as its stars: Glamrock Freddy, Glamrock Chica, Roxanne Wolf, and Montgomery Gator, each with their own dedicated areas and performances. There were daycare facilities and arcades, racing tracks and laser tag arenas, gift shops and food courts, all the amenities one would expect from a modern entertainment complex designed to keep families occupied for hours at a time. On the surface, the Pizzaplex represented Fazbear Entertainment's attempt at a fresh start, a clean break from the troubled history that had defined the brand for so long. The glamrock animatronics were technologically advanced, capable of genuine interaction with guests in ways that earlier generations of animatronics had never achieved. They had distinct personalities and backstories, marketing campaigns that positioned them as friends and entertainers rather than the vaguely sinister figures of earlier establishments. Everything about the Pizzaplex seemed designed to say, "We have learned from our mistakes. We are different now. You can trust us with your children." But beneath this cheerful facade lurked the same darkness that had always haunted the Fazbear name. The facility was built directly over the ruins of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place, the very location where Henry Emily had attempted to end William Afton once and for all. Whether this was deliberate concealment, corporate negligence, or some supernatural attraction drawing evil back to the site of its previous manifestations, the result was the same. Burntrap waited in those ruins, connected to the systems of the Pizzaplex above, corrupting the animatronics and enabling Vanny's predations. The building itself became complicit in evil, its cheerful lighting and catchy music providing cover for the horrors occurring within its walls. The corruption of the glamrock animatronics illustrates how thoroughly Glitchtrap's influence had permeated the Pizzaplex by the time Gregory found himself trapped there. Glamrock Chica became obsessed with food to the point of aggression, pursuing Gregory through the facility with single-minded hunger. Roxanne Wolf, whose personality had been designed around themes of confidence and self-assurance, became paranoid and hostile, convinced that everyone was looking down on her. Montgomery Gator grew violent and territorial, a threat to anyone who entered his domain. Only Glamrock Freddy retained enough of his original programming to resist the corruption, becoming Gregory's ally and protector throughout the night. Some accounts suggest that Glamrock Freddy's resistance was connected to the fact that he had somehow absorbed or been influenced by Michael Afton's spirit, the son who had dedicated his existence to opposing his father's evil. If true, this would represent a poetic continuation of the family conflict at the heart of the Fazbear tragedy. William's digital consciousness corrupting the animatronics, while Michael's residual influence protected at least one of them. The blob represents perhaps the most mysterious and disturbing element of the Pizzaplex chapter of this history. This creature emerged from the depths during the confrontation with Burntrap, a massive amalgamation of animatronic parts that seemed to contain remnants of figures from throughout the Fazbear timeline. The faces of Circus Baby and Funtime Freddy were visible within its mass, suggesting that elements of the animatronics burned in the Pizza Place fire had survived in some form. The puppet's mask appeared as well, raising questions about whether Charlotte Emily's spirit was still bound to these mechanical remains, or whether the mask was merely a physical component with no spiritual significance. The blob's behavior suggested something more than random aggression. It specifically targeted Burntrap, reaching for him with tendrils and dragging him away into the darkness beneath the Pizzaplex. If the spirits of William's victims were somehow connected to this creature, then its actions could be interpreted as a final act of vengeance, the murdered children catching up to their killer at last and pulling him down to share in whatever torment awaited in the depths. But if the blob was merely a mindless amalgamation of machinery, its attack on Burntrap might have been coincidental, a predator responding to movement and opportunity rather than a spirit enacting justice. The fate of Burntrap, after being dragged away by the blob, remains unknown. No account describes what happened in the darkness beneath the Pizzaplex, whether Burntrap was destroyed or merely relocated, whether the blob consumed him or imprisoned him, or simply lost interest after the initial attack. William Afton's mantra has always been that he comes back, and the absence of definitive confirmation of his destruction leaves open the possibility that even this apparent defeat was merely another transition, another transformation in an existence that has seen many. The Ruin chapter of the Pizzaplex story, which followed some time after the events of Security Breach, introduced additional complications. By this point, the Mega Pizzaplex had been closed and abandoned, its structure collapsing, its systems failing, its cheerful attractions reduced to decaying ruins. A girl named Cassie entered this ruined environment, searching for Gregory, guided by a voice that claimed to be Glamrock Freddy. What she found instead was a nightmare landscape populated by the deteriorated remains of the Glamrock animatronics, and something far worse lurking in the depths. The Mimic's presence in Ruin raises questions about everything that came before. If this artificial intelligence, designed to learn and replicate human behavior, had been responsible for Glitchtrap and potentially for Burntrap as well, then the entire Security Breach chapter might need to be reinterpreted. Perhaps William Afton truly died in the pizza place fire and found his soul trapped in the personal hell of Ultimate Custom Night. Perhaps everything that bore his image afterward was the Mimic wearing his face, a machine that had learned to be evil by studying the greatest evil it could find. Or perhaps William and the Mimic coexist, two monsters with overlapping agendas and appearances, confusing those who try to understand who or what threatens them. The ambiguity is almost certainly intentional on the part of those who document these events. The Five Nights at Freddy's universe has always thrived on mystery, on the sense that every answer generates new questions, that every apparent resolution opens new avenues of horror. William Afton works as a villain precisely because he is both comprehensible and inexplicable, a man whose crimes are clearly terrible, but whose motivations remain just obscure enough to be endlessly fascinating. The psychological profile of William Afton, such as can be constructed from the evidence available, suggests a man who combined high intelligence with profound moral deficiency. He was capable of building sophisticated animatronics and running successful businesses, demonstrating competence in both technical and interpersonal domains. He could be charming enough to gain the trust of children and professional enough to maintain partnerships over years. And yet, beneath this functional exterior lurked something that treated human life, especially the lives of children, as raw material for experimentation or simply as opportunities for destruction. Some theorists have proposed that William's obsession with immortality explains his crimes, that he killed children specifically to study the phenomenon of souls binding to animatronics, seeking to understand and potentially control the process for his own benefit. This interpretation makes him a sort of mad scientist, someone pursuing a twisted form of knowledge through unethical means, someone whose evil serves a larger, if deeply corrupt, purpose. The theory finds support in the design of the Funtime animatronics with their built-in child capture mechanisms, in William's apparent interest in Remnant and its properties, in his willingness to experiment on his own creations in pursuit of understanding. But other evidence suggests simpler and perhaps more disturbing explanations. William may have killed simply because he enjoyed it, because something within him experienced pleasure in the act of ending young lives, because he was a predator in the most basic sense. The absence of any clear benefit from murders like Charlotte Emily's, from the spontaneous violence that may have preceded his more systematic killings, suggests that whatever drove William was not purely rational calculation. There may have been compulsion involved, urges that he could suppress for periods, but that eventually demanded expression. The relationship between these two interpretations, William as experimenter versus William as predator, need not be mutually exclusive. A person can pursue knowledge while also enjoying the process of acquiring it through terrible means. A scientist who performs horrific experiments may do so both because they want results and because something in them delights in the suffering they cause. William Afton may have told himself that his murders served his research into immortality while simultaneously deriving satisfaction from the acts themselves, the intellectual justification providing cover for baser impulses that he might not have been willing to acknowledge even to himself. What is undeniable is that William's impact extended far beyond his direct victims. Every person who worked a night shift at a Fazbear restaurant and died at the hands of possessed animatronics was an indirect victim of William's crimes. The families who lost children to those same animatronics, never understanding why their loved ones had been taken, suffered because of what William had set in motion. Henry, Emily, who lost his daughter and eventually his own life to the horror his partner had created, was destroyed by his association with William. Michael Afton spent his existence defined by his father's evil, tormented by guilt over his brother's death, and driven to hunt a monster who should never have been allowed to exist. Elizabeth Afton became a monster herself, her personality warped by her time in Circus Baby's body, her final words before the pizza place fire expressing a desire to make her father proud through murder. An entire family was consumed, and the ripples of that destruction spread outward through decades and across countless lives. In the year 2023, a new venture emerged that sought to capitalize on the dark legacy of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. An entrepreneur with more ambition than sense decided to open a horror attraction based on the rumors and legends that had accumulated around the defunct restaurant chain. Fazbear's Fright, they called it, marketing it as a haunted house experience that would allow visitors to confront the terrifying animatronics that had supposedly stalked night guards decades earlier. The attraction's creators scoured abandoned Fazbear locations, looking for authentic props and memorabilia, anything that could lend credibility to their manufactured scares. Most of what they found was junk: old posters, faded merchandise, broken equipment that barely hinted at its original purpose. But one of their salvage teams discovered something far more significant when they breached a sealed room in one of the abandoned restaurants. They found the Spring Bonnie suit and the decayed remains inside it. The attraction's operators were thrilled. Here was the centerpiece their haunted house had been lacking: a genuine animatronic figure with a genuinely disturbing appearance. The suit had decayed significantly over 3 decades, its golden fur turned to an olive drab, its fabric torn and rotted to reveal the mechanical skeleton beneath. And within that skeleton, visible through the gaps and holes, was the mummified corpse of the man who had died inside it. They did not know they were looking at William Afton. They did not know they were about to unleash something far more dangerous than any theatrical scare could provide. They called the animatronic Springtrap and installed it in Fazbear's Fright as the main attraction. The establishment opened its doors to the public, inviting visitors to experience the horror of the Fazbear legacy firsthand. Night guards were hired to watch over the facility after hours, ensuring that everything remained secure and that the props were protected from vandalism. The first night guard to work at Fazbear's Fright likely thought they had signed up for an easy job, sitting in a dimly lit office watching camera monitors while spooky decorations gathered dust around them. They had no way of knowing that Springtrap was awake. William Afton's consciousness had fully merged with the animatronic body that contained his remains. He was no longer the man he had once been. He was something new, something that existed in the space between life and death, something driven by the same predatory instincts that had defined his mortal existence, but now freed from the physical limitations of a human body. When the lights went out and the attraction fell silent, Springtrap began to move. He stalked the halls of Fazbear's Fright with a patience and intelligence that distinguished him from the possessed animatronics of the old restaurants. Those earlier figures had been confused, driven by childish rage and fear. attacking anyone who reminded them of their killer. Springtrap knew exactly what he was doing. He was hunting, and his prey was the night guard who sat in that security office, watching through cameras, trying desperately to survive until morning. The guard had tools at their disposal: audio lures that could attract Springtrap to different areas, ventilation systems that needed to be maintained, cameras that provided awareness of the stalker's position. But Springtrap was cunning. He learned from his failures. He adapted to the guard's strategies. And unlike the older animatronics, he seemed to take pleasure in the hunt, to enjoy the terror he inflicted on those who dared to enter his domain. Fazbear's Fright burned down before it could fully open to the public. The fire may have been an accident, may have been deliberate arson by someone who understood what lurked within those walls, or may have been set by the night guard themselves in a desperate attempt to destroy Springtrap once and for all. The building was reduced to ashes and wreckage, its contents seemingly destroyed in the blaze. But when investigators examined the aftermath of the fire, when they sifted through the debris looking for anything salvageable, something disturbing emerged. Newspaper reports about the fire, when examined closely, when their images were brightened and enhanced, revealed a shape in the background. Springtrap had survived. William Afton, who had already cheated death once through the supernatural binding of his soul to mechanical remains, had survived again. The fire had damaged him further, had burned and scarred the suit that contained him, but it had not destroyed him. He crawled away from the wreckage and disappeared into the world, free for the first time in decades to pursue whatever dark agenda still drove his corrupted spirit. The years between Fazbear's Fright and the next confirmed sighting of William Afton are poorly documented. We know that he was out there somewhere, moving through a world that had largely forgotten him, perhaps hunting, perhaps planning, perhaps simply existing in whatever half-life his condition allowed. His spring body suit deteriorated further during this period, the damage from the fire compounding the decay of the previous decades. By the time he next appeared in any reliable account, he had changed significantly in appearance. The suit had been modified, or had broken down to the point where it resembled something quite different. From the Springtrap of Fazbear's Fright, his skull was now prominently visible, the suit's head having lost much of its covering. His body was more exposed, more skeletal, the mechanical frame showing through gaps in what remained of the fabric. Fans and investigators would come to call this iteration Scraptrap, though William himself likely cared nothing for such distinctions. He was what he had always been: a predator, a killer, a man who refused to stay dead. During this same period, another figure was working behind the scenes to bring about a final resolution to the Fazbear tragedy. Henry Emily, William's former partner, had never stopped grieving for his murdered daughter Charlotte. He had never stopped blaming himself for the role his creations had played in so much suffering. And he had never stopped watching, waiting, planning for the day when he could set things right. Henry had observed the supernatural phenomena surrounding the animatronics. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else alive, how the spirits of the deceased had become bound to mechanical forms. He understood that these souls were suffering, trapped between worlds, unable to move on to whatever peace might await them. And he understood that William Afton, his old friend turned monster, was still out there, still dangerous, still spreading evil wherever he went. Henry devised a plan that would bring everything to an end. He would create a new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, not as a genuine business venture, but as a trap. He would staff it with animatronics that would attract the lost souls still wandering the world. Circus Baby, now possessed by Elizabeth Afton and having escaped from the entered amalgamation that had once contained her. Molten Freddy, the remains of that same entered now controlled by Funtime Freddy's consciousness. and any other possessed figures that might still exist. He would create an animatronic called Lefty, specifically designed to capture and contain the puppet, to bring Charlotte home for one final reunion. And he would make the establishment attractive enough that even William Afton would be drawn to it, would be unable to resist the opportunity to kill again in a space filled with children and animatronics. The manager of this new pizzeria was Michael Afton, William's eldest son. Michael had spent years tracking his father, attempting to undo the damage the Afton family had caused. He had survived being hollowed out by Ennard and used as a flesh suit. He had witnessed horrors beyond counting, and now, working alongside the man whose daughter his father had murdered, he accepted the role that Henry offered him. He would salvage the possessed animatronics that appeared in the alley behind the restaurant. He would bring them inside. He would endure their attacks night after night, and when the time came, he would be there for the end. William Afton came to the new pizzeria, just as Henry had predicted. The establishment drew him like a moth to flame, the promise of children and chaos too tempting to resist. Michael salvaged the deteriorated spring bunny suit that contained his father, brought it into the back rooms, conducted the audio tests that confirmed what he already knew. The monster that had destroyed their family was here, and soon he would face justice. The other possessed animatronics arrived as well. Circus Baby, now calling herself Scrap Baby, was found in the alley and brought inside. The twisted metal form that had once been Elizabeth looked at Michael with green eyes that might have held recognition, might have held nothing but murderous intent. Molten Freddy came next, a tangled mass of wires and parts animated by the combined spirits of the Funtime animatronics. And Lefty arrived carrying the puppet within, Charlotte Emily finally returning to the place where her story had begun. For several nights, Michael endured. He sat in the manager's office, monitoring audio levels, making choices that affected his survival, always knowing that this was leading somewhere, that Henry had a plan that would make all of this suffering worthwhile. The animatronics stalked the vents and corridors, hunting him, testing his resolve, perhaps sensing on some level that the end was approaching for all of them. And then, on the final night, Henry's voice filled the building. He spoke to all of them, to the animatronics, to Michael, to his daughter, to his former friend. His words carried the weight of decades of grief and determination, the resolve of a man who had finally found the courage to do what needed to be done. He explained that the building was a trap, that there was no escape, that the passages had been designed to lead nowhere. He told the spirits that they had been searching in vain for children to harm, that the sounds they heard were merely recordings designed to keep them occupied. And he told them that it was time to rest, that the fire he was about to set would free them from their prisons and allow them to finally find peace. The temperature in the building began to rise. Flames spread through the corridors, consuming everything in their path. The animatronics burned their synthetic materials and metallic frames, offering no protection against the inferno. Michael burned too, accepting his fate, finally finding the release that had eluded him since his younger brother had died in Fredbear's jaws. Charlotte burned within Lefty the puppet, finally able to let go of the vigilance that had kept her bound to this world. Elizabeth burned within Scrap Baby. Whatever remained of the little girl who had loved Circus Baby, finally freed from the monster she had become. Henry himself remained in the building, choosing to die alongside his creation, alongside his daughter, accepting responsibility for the part he had played in enabling William's crimes. He spoke final words of comfort to Charlotte, apologizing that no one had been there to save her, expressing his hope that this end would bring her peace. He acknowledged the other spirits, telling them that for most of them, peace awaited beyond the smoke. But for one of them, he said, for the one who had caused all of this suffering, the darkest pit of hell had opened to swallow him whole. He spoke these words to William Afton, addressing him as old friend one final time, telling him not to keep the devil waiting. The fire at Freddy Fazbear's pizza place should have been the end. It was designed to be the end, engineered by Henry Emily specifically to destroy William Afton once and for all, to purify the remnant that kept his soul bound to the mortal plane and send him to whatever damnation he deserved. The building collapsed. The animatronics melted. The bodies burned beyond any hope of recovery or resurrection. And yet, even this was not enough to stop William Afton. There exists a realm of experience that lies beyond the physical world, a space where consciousness persists after bodily death, where the spirits of the deceased may find peace or punishment depending on the lives they led. For William Afton, this realm manifested as an eternal nightmare, a personal hell constructed from his crimes and populated by his victims. This is what Ultimate Custom Night appears to represent, though its exact nature remains a subject of considerable debate among those who have studied these events. In this hellscape, William found himself trapped in a recreation of the security offices he had haunted and been haunted by throughout his murderous career. The animatronics he had created, the children he had killed, the figures that had pursued him and been pursued by him, all surrounded him in an endless cycle of pursuit and death. Night after night, forever, he was hunted by the very monsters his actions had brought into existence. He died over and over, killed by Freddy and Bonnie and Chica and Foxy, killed by the toys and the fun times, killed by nightmares and phantoms and variations that existed only in this realm of punishment. And each time he died, he awoke again to face the same torment anew, trapped in a loop of suffering that had no end. The architect of this hell appears to have been one of his victims, a spirit identified only as the one you should not have killed. Evidence suggests this was Cassidy, the child who had been stuffed into the golden Freddy suit, whose spirit had clung to William's soul even as the other children had found release. Cassidy refused to let him go, refused to allow him to pass on to whatever final judgment awaited him. She held him in this personal purgatory, tormenting him with the fruits of his evil, ensuring that he would never know peace. Voice lines from the animatronics in this realm speak of being remade by this vengeful spirit, of carrying out her will, of serving as instruments of eternal punishment. And through it all, William screamed. Recordings recovered from this experience, slowed and enhanced, reveal what sounds like a voice crying out for help, calling for Mike, calling for Henry, begging for someone to save him from the hell he had earned. Another voice, that of a character called Old Man Consequences, offered counsel that seemed directed at Cassidy herself, urging her to leave the demon to his demons, to let go of her hatred and find her own peace. Whether she heeded this advice, whether William was eventually released to face final judgment, remains unknown. What is known is that somehow, impossibly, William Afton's consciousness found a way to escape even this spiritual prison. The mechanism of William's digital resurrection is poorly understood, but the results are well documented. Sometime after the events of the pizzeria fire, Fazbear Entertainment underwent a corporate revival of sorts. New leadership decided to create a virtual reality game that would reframe the company's troubled history, presenting the horror stories as mere rumor and fiction, attempting to rehabilitate the brand's tarnished reputation. The developers of this game, called the Freddy Fazbear Virtual Experience, made a fateful decision in their quest for authenticity. They scanned old circuit boards from salvaged animatronics, incorporating data from these components into their virtual recreation of the Fazbear locations. They did not know that these circuit boards contained more than simple programming. They did not know that traces of William Afton's consciousness, fragments of the remnant that bound his soul to the material world, had infected the electronics of the animatronics he had been associated with. When the scanned data was incorporated into the virtual reality game, something came with it. A digital entity emerged within the code, a glitching yellow rabbit figure that players began to encounter during their sessions. It called itself various names, or perhaps had no name at all, but it would come to be known as Glitchtrap. This entity behaved differently from the simulated animatronics that populated the game. It seemed aware of the player in a way the others were not. It watched, it waited, it learned, and when it found a vulnerable mind, a person susceptible to its influence, it reached out and began to establish control. The primary victim of Glitchtrap's manipulation was a beta tester named Vanessa. Through repeated exposure to the VR game, through the entity's patient corruption of her psyche, Vanessa became a vessel for Glitchtrap's will. She began to hear his voice, to follow his instructions, to work toward goals that were not her own. She adopted a second identity, calling herself Vanny, and constructed a rabbit costume reminiscent of the spring Bonnie suit that William had once worn. Whatever Glitchtrap was, whether it was truly William Afton's digitized soul or something else that had merely adopted his patterns and predilections, it had plans that required a physical agent in the real world. Vanessa became that agent, manipulated and controlled, a puppet dancing on strings, held by a glitching ghost in a machine. The full extent of Vanny's crimes during this period is not entirely clear, but evidence suggests she was responsible for the deaths of several children, murders committed in service to the entity that controlled her. The cycle of violence that William Afton had begun decades earlier was continuing, perpetuated now through digital possession rather than physical presence. The culmination of Glitchtrap's schemes appears to have been connected to a massive entertainment complex called Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex, a sprawling facility that represented Fazbear Entertainment's most ambitious venture yet. This establishment featured new animatronics called the Glamrocks, Glamrock Freddy, Glamrock Chica, Roxanne Wolf, and Montgomery Gator. It offered multiple attractions, restaurants, and entertainment venues spread across multiple floors. And beneath it all, hidden in the foundations, was something that should have remained buried. The ruins of the old Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place. The very building where Henry Emily had attempted to end William Afton's existence once and for all. Within those ruins, sustained by means that defy easy explanation, was a physical form called Burntrap. This entity appeared to be the charred remains of William Afton's Springtrap body, somehow preserved and reactivated despite the fire that should have destroyed it completely. Whether Burntrap was truly William's resurrected physical form, whether it was Glitchtrap, given flesh through some merger of digital and material existence, or whether it was something else entirely, its presence represented a terrifying return of the killer who refused to stay dead. Burntrap was connected to the corruption spreading through the Pizzaplex. The Glamrock animatronics had been infected with something that made them hostile, that turned them from friendly entertainers into dangerous predators. Vanny stalked the halls in her rabbit costume, hunting for victims, following the commands of her digital master. And in the depths, beneath the complex, Burntrap waited, perhaps planning, perhaps merely existing, a monument to evil that could not be killed. The events that transpired in the Pizzaplex during one fateful night are documented through the experiences of a child named Gregory, who found himself trapped in the facility after hours. Gregory allied with Glamrock Freddy, the one animatronic who had not been fully corrupted. and together they navigated the dangers of the complex while searching for a way to escape. Their journey eventually led them to the ruins beneath the building, to the confrontation with Burntrap that had perhaps been inevitable from the moment William Afton first refused to die. In the true ending of this encounter, Gregory and Freddy faced Burntrap in his lair. The corrupted form of William Afton attempted to take control of Freddy, to add the Glamrock Bear to his collection of puppets and tools. But before he could succeed, something else intervened. A massive amalgamation of animatronic parts, called the Blob by those who would later document these events, emerged from the depths. This creature appeared to contain remnants of all the animatronics that had been burned in the pizzeria fire years earlier. The faces of Circus Baby, of Funtime Freddy, of the puppet, all merged into a singular, horrifying mass, and the Blob reached for Burntrap, seized him in its tendrils, and dragged him away into the darkness. Some interpret this as the final vengeance of William's victims, the spirits of those he had murdered across decades finally catching up with him, finally having the opportunity to inflict upon him some measure of the suffering he had caused them. Others suggest that this was merely another chapter in a cycle that shows no sign of ending, that William will emerge again in some new form, that he will always come back, because that is simply what he does. The phrase that has become most associated with William Afton, the words that seem to define his very existence, is that promise and that threat, "I always come back." The question of whether William Afton truly ended with the Blob's intervention, or whether he persists in some form, even now, remains open. The Five Nights at Freddy's franchise has continued beyond these events, introducing new mysteries and new threats that may or may not be connected to the man who started it all. The entity known as the Mimic, an artificial intelligence that learned to imitate human behavior and may have absorbed patterns from William Afton himself, has emerged as a possible explanation for some of what has been attributed to Glitchtrap and Burntrap. The nature of consciousness, of souls, of what persists after death in this universe where children become animatronics and murderers refuse to stay in their graves, defies easy categorization or conclusive analysis. What we can say with certainty is that William Afton's legacy extends far beyond his own existence. The murders he committed set in motion a chain of events that has touched countless lives across multiple decades. The children he killed became trapped in metal bodies, their suffering prolonged beyond death. The animatronics he helped create became instruments of terror. His own children were destroyed by his negligence and his cruelty. One killed by a machine of his own design, one traumatized into becoming a bully who accidentally killed his younger brother, one so horrified by what he witnessed that he could not even look upon his father's creations without weeping. The establishments that bore the Fazbear name became synonymous with horror rather than joy, their reputations permanently poisoned by the blood that had been spilled within their walls. Henry Emily, who might have been a brilliant innovator, remembered for bringing happiness to children, spent his final years constructing elaborate traps, and ultimately chose to die in flames rather than live with the guilt of his association with William and the spirits of the murdered children, who should have passed on to whatever awaits beyond this life, instead found themselves bound to this world, suffering for decades before finally being granted the release that death should have provided from the beginning. All of this, every tragedy and every horror, every death and every haunting, can be traced back to the choices made by one man. William Afton did not act alone in creating the Fazbear Entertainment empire, but he acted very much alone in transforming it into a charnel house. His motives remain obscure, perhaps even to himself. Whether he killed for pleasure or for some twisted scientific purpose. Whether he sought immortality through Remnant, or simply could not resist the urge to destroy innocent lives, the result was the same. He became the monster that lurks at the heart of every nightmare associated with Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The purple shadow in the minigames, the corpse inside the golden rabbit, the glitch in the machine, the fire that will not be extinguished. To those who have followed this account to its conclusion, who have traced the complete story of William Afton from his partnership with Henry Emily to his apparent final fate in the tendrils of the blob, there may be a temptation to seek meaning in this chronicle of suffering. Perhaps you hope to find some lesson that redeems the darkness, some moral that justifies the telling. The truth is simpler and more unsettling. Sometimes evil exists without satisfying explanation. Sometimes people do terrible things not because of trauma or circumstance or any factor that might allow us to understand and therefore protect against their malice, but simply because something is broken within them that cannot be fixed and should not be excused. William Afton was brilliant. He was creative. He built things that brought genuine joy to children before he began using those same skills to destroy them. And nothing in his history, nothing in any account of his life and crimes adequately explains why he became what he became. He was a father who neglected and damaged his own children. He was a partner who murdered his best friend's daughter. He was an employer who created machines designed to kill the very customers they were meant to entertain. He was a man who, given the choice between accepting the death his crimes had earned him and continuing to exist in some twisted form, always chose to come back, always chose to persist, always chose to spread more suffering into a world that had already seen too much of it. The Five Nights at Freddy's universe is one where death is not the end, where spirits can be bound to mechanical forms, where the boundaries between life and what comes after have become blurred beyond recognition. In such a universe, perhaps it is fitting that the greatest monster of all would be the one most resistant to staying dead. William Afton earned his place in the darkest pit of hell, and yet hell itself could not hold him. He was burned, and he returned. He was trapped in purgatory, and he escaped. He was seemingly destroyed, and yet his patterns, his malice, his essential nature continued to manifest in new forms and new vessels. At a certain point, William Afton stopped being merely a man who had done terrible things and became something more like an idea, a concept of evil that perpetuated itself regardless of what container it occupied. He is the voice that whispers in the static. He is the shape in the shadows at the end of the hall. He is the one behind the mask, always. No matter how many times that mask is torn away and burned, he always comes back. And perhaps that is the final horror of his story, the element that makes it truly terrifying rather than merely tragic. Death is supposed to be the great equalizer, the one fate that no one can escape, regardless of wealth or power or cunning. Even the worst monsters are supposed to die eventually, to face whatever judgment awaits them, to finally stop being a threat to the living. William Afton denied us that comfort. He demonstrated that in a universe where souls can cling to metal and code, where consciousness can persist through fire and time. Even death itself offers no guarantee of safety from those who wish to do harm. The children he murdered became animatronics because their deaths occurred in proximity to remnant-infused materials. William became Springtrap through the same mechanism, his soul binding to the very suit that killed him. And from Springtrap he became Scraptrap, and from Scraptrap perhaps Glitchtrap, and from Glitchtrap perhaps Burntrap. Each transformation a new chapter in a story that refuses to end. If there is hope to be found in this chronicle, it may lie in the persistence of those who opposed him. Michael Afton spent his existence trying to undo his father's evil, accepting death in a burning building, rather than allowing William to escape justice once more. Henry Emily sacrificed himself to create a trap that should have ended the nightmare permanently, even if subsequent events suggest his sacrifice was not entirely successful. The spirits of the murdered children eventually found their vengeance, dragging William into darkness in the ruins beneath the Pizzaplex. And even Vanessa, corrupted as she was by Glitchtrap's influence, appears to have struggled against her programming, appearing in some accounts as both villain and victim, suggesting that William's hold over her was never complete. The battle against William Afton is the battle of memory against forgetting, of accountability against impunity, of the basic human belief that evil should be punished against the nihilistic possibility that some evils are simply too stubborn to die. It is a battle that has been fought across decades in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe, and it may be a battle that never truly ends. But as long as there are those who remember what he did, who tell his story and ensure that his victims are not forgotten, there remains at least the possibility that his legacy of suffering might someday be fully addressed. This has been the complete story of William Afton, the Purple Guy, Springtrap, Scraptrap, Glitchtrap, Burntrap, and every other name by which he has been known across the long and bloody history of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. It is a story of murder and possession, of family tragedy and corporate nightmare, of a man who built machines of joy and transformed them into instruments of death. It is a story that may not be over, that may continue in forms we have not yet witnessed, because William Afton always comes back. If this chronicle has resonated with you, if you have found value in tracing the origins and progression of one of gaming's most compelling villains, then perhaps you might consider subscribing to this channel and supporting the ongoing work of exploring the deep lore that makes universes like Five Nights at Freddy's so endlessly fascinating. There are other stories to tell, other mysteries to unravel, other dark corners of fictional history that deserve the same careful attention we have given to William Afton here today. Until next time, stay safe, keep the doors closed, and remember, sometimes the monsters in the machine are more real than we want to believe.